The book of Genesis contains many puzzling and controversial passages that have led to intense debates among scholars, religious leaders, and curious readers for over 2,000 years. One of the most disputed is the so-called Curse of Ham, a declaration made by Noah that continues to raise questions today. But what was this curse really about? Why did Noah condemn his own descendant? And most importantly, has this passage been correctly understood over the centuries? This is one of the most misinterpreted and misused texts in the Bible. Worse, it has been exploited to justify terrible injustices and promote false beliefs about the superiority of certain groups over others. Today, we will closely examine this passage, break down every detail, and uncover the real meaning behind the Curse of Ham. If you find this topic interesting, be sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with others. Now, prepare for a deep dive into the hidden meanings of Genesis, the Curse of Ham, the real story. This passage has been among the most misrepresented in the Bible. For centuries, especially from the Middle Ages to modern times, it was wrongly used to support ideas of racial and social hierarchy, claiming that some people were meant to rule while others were destined for servitude. However, this interpretation is completely wrong and misrepresents the true meaning of the biblical passage. The story of the Curse of Ham appears in the book of Genesis and describes a punishment given by Noah, not directly to Ham but to his youngest son, Canaan. The event takes place under unusual circumstances. After planting a vineyard and drinking too much wine, Noah becomes drunk and falls asleep naked inside his tent. His son Ham sees him in this vulnerable state and commits an act that is considered shameful, although the text does not clearly explain the seriousness of Ham's actions. What is certain is that Noah responds with a strong curse. But why did Noah curse his grandson Canaan instead of Ham, who was the one who made the mistake? This is one of the most puzzling aspects of the story. To understand it, we need to consider the cultural context of that time. The world was in a period of renewal after the Great Flood. In ancient societies, especially in tribal communities, a man's greatest asset was his family, his children and descendants. By cursing Canaan, Noah was actually delivering an even deeper punishment to Ham by dishonoring his lineage. In that culture, a curse on a child had far-reaching consequences, often affecting future generations. This is how the story was passed down, but over time, it was distorted to serve purposes that had nothing to do with its original meaning. Many people struggle to understand why Noah reacted so severely. Some argue that he was justified, while others see his actions as unfair. But when we examine the text closely, we see that the situation is more complicated than a simple curse. The account places Noah in a newly restored world after the flood. He decides to plant a vineyard, harvests its fruit, and ferments it into wine. The problem arises when he drinks too much and becomes completely intoxicated. In the biblical context, drunkenness is also viewed as a failing, showing that even Noah was not without faults. While in his drunken state, Noah exposes himself inside his tent. It is at this moment that Ham enters, sees his father in an embarrassing condition, and instead of handling the situation with respect, goes out and tells his brothers, Shem and Japheth. Unlike Ham, Shem and Japheth do not spread the news or make a spectacle of their father's state. Instead, they take a blanket, walk backward, and cover Noah to protect his dignity, avoiding any direct sight of his nakedness. The main question is, what exactly was Ham's mistake? Many people believe Noah was unfair in punishing him, especially since Noah himself was drunk. However, the story suggests that the issue wasn't just that Ham saw his father naked, it was how he responded. Instead of showing respect and protecting Noah's dignity, Ham chose to expose him. His mistake was not simply witnessing the scene, but failing to handle it with discretion and care. In the culture of that time, failing to protect a father's honor was a serious offense. In contrast, Ham's brothers, Shem and Japheth, recognized the gravity of the situation. Rather than drawing attention to their father's shame, they covered him without looking, ensuring his dignity remained intact. When Noah woke up and learned what had happened, he reacted strongly, cursing Canaan, Ham's son. This is an important detail. It shows that the punishment was tied to the humiliation Ham caused, not just to the fact that he saw Noah naked. Many wonder why Canaan was cursed instead of Ham. If Ham was the one who made the mistake, why did the consequences fall on his son? To understand this, we need to consider the social structure of that time. In ancient tribal societies, a man's greatest legacy was his descendants. Attacking his children was a far greater punishment than punishing him directly. That is exactly what Noah did. He targeted Ham's lineage by cursing Canaan. One of the biggest misunderstandings about this passage is the belief that all of Ham's descendants were cursed. This idea, which was later misused to justify racial superiority, has no basis in the actual biblical text. Noah's curse was specifically directed at Canaan and his descendants, not all of Ham's children. The text clearly states that Canaan would serve Shem and Japheth. There is no mention of a curse extending to all of Ham's lineage. Despite this, many people throughout history have distorted this passage, falsely claiming that Ham's entire lineage was cursed. This misinterpretation has been used to support harmful and false beliefs, even though it is not supported by Scripture. In fact, Genesis states that God blessed Noah and his sons, which means Ham also received a divine blessing. So, who was Ham, and which peoples descended from him? According to ancient Jewish tradition and early Christian interpretations, Ham was considered the ancestor of various nations. Genesis 10 lists the groups that emerged after the flood, including those linked to Ham. The Hamites, as they were called, were traditionally associated with African and Near Eastern peoples. Since ancient times, Jewish interpretations have connected Ham with the ancestors of African nations. This was not just a cultural belief, but an interpretation based on the Hebrew language itself. The name Ham is linked to the idea of something dark or burned. His son Cush's name literally means black, and the Cushites were identified in Scripture as a people with dark skin. The Genesis account not only disproves the false idea that all of Ham's descendants were cursed, but also provides insight into the origins of many nations. While this passage has been misinterpreted and misused throughout history, the text itself contradicts such distortions. One key point must be emphasized. Noah's curse was not placed on all of Ham's descendants, but specifically on Canaan and his lineage, the Canaanites. According to Jewish sources like the Book of Jubilees, Canaan later received a second curse for taking land that was meant for Shem's descendants. He acted against the warnings of his father, Ham, and his brothers, Cush, ancestor of the Cushites, or Black Nations, and Mizraim, father of the ancient Egyptians. The account states that Ham and his other sons warned Canaan not to settle in territory that did not belong to him, but he refused to listen. As a result, he faced a second curse. The Scriptures describe the Canaanites as a people who later turned to idolatry and practices considered sinful by God, reinforcing their cursed status. However, there is an important detail that is often overlooked. This curse was not permanent. The Bible itself shows that many Canaanites were redeemed because they turned to the true God, the God of Noah, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. From the beginning, divine mercy allowed anyone, regardless of ancestry, to be saved through faith and obedience. A fascinating but often ignored fact is that several Canaanites not only found salvation, but played important roles in biblical history. One well-known example is Rahab, the Canaanite woman from Jericho, whose faith saved her and her family. She later became part of the lineage of the Messiah. Another significant figure was Uriah the Hittite, also descended from the Canaanites. God's anger toward King David for Uriah's murder proves that the Canaanite lineage was never completely rejected by God. Despite this, many people, especially during the Middle Ages, twisted the biblical story to justify slavery. Some falsely claimed that all of Ham's descendants were cursed and meant to serve Japheth's descendants, whom they mistakenly linked to European peoples. This misinterpretation was used for centuries to justify the enslavement of various groups, particularly Africans, even though there is no biblical basis for such a claim. However, the truth, both biblically and historically, is quite different. Slavery was never limited to a single group of people. For example, the Israelites themselves were enslaved by the Egyptians, who were descendants of Ham. Centuries later, the Israelites were taken into captivity by the Babylonians, who were descendants of Shem during the reign of Nebuchadnezzar. Interestingly, Abraham himself was a Chaldean, showing the complex relationships between these different peoples. Likewise, the Celts and Germanic tribes, who had very fair skin, were enslaved by the Romans, who saw them as barbarians, regardless of their appearance. This makes it clear that the idea of the curse of Canaan being a divine justification for the enslavement of African people is entirely false. This misinterpretation was promoted for centuries, but it has no foundation in the original biblical text. The true message of Scripture teaches that God's salvation and blessings are not based on race or ancestry, but on faith and obedience to Him. The Bible repeatedly shows that African nations played important roles in God's divine plan. Many African peoples are mentioned throughout Scripture as those who served the Lord. In His mercy, God sent prophets to guide them away from idolatry and toward true faith. A powerful example appears in the book of Isaiah, where God commands the prophet to walk naked for 3 years as a sign to the Ethiopians and Egyptians, urging them to return to Him. This demonstrates that far from being cursed or rejected, these nations were valued and given the opportunity for salvation. People often ask whether Africans were cursed by Noah, and the answer is simple: no. That idea is entirely false. Noah's curse was directed at the Canaanites, not at all of Ham's descendants. And here's an important point. This curse didn't come from God, but from Noah himself. Even so, many Canaanites turned to God, proving that faith and devotion mattered far more than ancestry. I hope this explanation has helped clarify the real meaning of Ham's curse. If you found this discussion insightful, share your thoughts in the comments. If you'd like me to cover another related topic, feel free to suggest it. May God bless you all, and see you next time.